Well, I'm going to welcome everyone to the 72nd annual meeting. Today we have another great panel discussion on advocacy, and this is being moderated by Peter Burns from the ARC-US, along with a few other staff members, and also with Philip from our office. And I'm going to turn it over to Philip in a minute, but I muted everyone upon entry. Please keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking. And also, if you wanted to have a speaker view, you can go up to the right-hand corner of your screen. There's a view button. You can do speaker or gallery. It's totally up to you how you want to view it. And we'll take questions at the end. You can also put it in your chat in the chat box or raise your hand. So now I will turn it over to Philip. Need to unmute, Philip.
Yeah, rookie mistake, I guess. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Bridget, for that. And welcome, everyone, to this session with the ARC-US. And I just want to say, we're talking about advocacy, and I know that we beat that drum all the time. But today, I think we wanted to talk about how advocacy is more than simply doing a singular action. Many times we ask you to do a one-click campaign or call your legislators, but it really requires approaching an issue from many different sides, engaging partnerships, your legislative champions, a diverse group of stakeholders, grassroots advocates, media, and the list goes on. So I just thought that we might peek behind the curtain a little bit and kind of see how your action that we encourage you to take and you do take impacts every other portion of our advocacy and leads to a really successful campaign and the outcome that we're going for. So I just want to quickly introduce our panel and then hand it over to them to introduce themselves more completely. Again, moderator is Peter Burns, Chief Executive Officer of the ARC United States. Myself, Philip, I'm the Director of Governmental Affairs for the ARC New York. Nicole Jorwick, Senior Executive Officer, State Advocacy, Senior Director of Public Policy of the ARC United States. Claire Manning, Senior Director, Advocacy and Mobilization at the ARC-US. And Kristen Wright, Communication Director at the ARC-US. So I'll hand it over to, Nicole, then Claire, then Kristen, and then back to Peter to close, and then you can continue from there.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nicole Jorwick with the ARC. Glad to be here to talk a little bit more about, I guess, under the hood and behind the curtain, as to use Philip's analogy, around how we advocate both within the disability community and more broadly. Folks that don't know me, you already heard my title. I'm also a family member. My brother Chris is 32 and has autism. So all this work is personal to me. Not that it has to be for everyone, but it definitely drives what I do. So thanks for the opportunity to further introduce myself. Claire, I guess.
Claire.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Manning, the Senior Director of Advocacy and Mobilization. I think I said this during our presentation last year, but I am from New Jersey. So I love talking to New York because I live in DC now, but I feel like we're culturally connected. We get each other. So I'm excited to be on with you all today. I have been on board at the ARC almost 5 years. It's gone by really fast. And in my role here, I work with chapters, I work with family members, all across the country to really make their voices heard on the issues that are just critical to our community. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you today, to use another Philip kind of analogy about how the sausage gets made.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Wright. I'm Director of Communications at the ARC's National Office. First, thank you, Philip, for having us back again. And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I'm excited to share a bit today about what's happening on the media front. It's all very encouraging and exciting. Part of what our communications team does at the National Office is to work to get the interests of people with disabilities, like my brother. I'm also a sibling like Nicole, and the needs of families and direct support professionals into the spotlight. So whether that's the local spotlight or a regional spotlight or the national spotlight, newspapers, magazines, TV, digital publications, radio, all of it, that's the goal. So, what I always think is that we need journalists telling the story, because there's so many stories to be told. And just as a preview to what I look forward to sharing more with you about today is that we right now are seeing a lot of interest from the media. It feels like journalists want to learn about our priorities and our top issues and home and community-based services and what that means. And they want to talk to people with disabilities, family members, direct support professionals about why we're all fighting so hard for the things that we're fighting for. And journalists want to tell these stories. So thanks again for having us. I look forward to the discussion today. I've been with the ARC for 2.5 years. Learned a whole lot during that time. I come from a media and journalism background. So thanks again for having us and looking forward to the rest of our talk.
Thank you, Kristen. And hi, everyone. This is Peter Burns. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the ARC, and it's so great to be with all of you this afternoon. We have a great session planned for you today. A little bit of personal background on myself. I have been the Chief Executive Officer of the ARC for just over 13 years now, and I have spent my entire career in advocacy in the nonprofit sector. Some of you may know I'm an attorney by profession, and before coming to the ARC, I spent 16 years running a statewide association of nonprofit organizations in Maryland, and then worked for the Maryland Attorney General's office before that. And in the course of my professional career, I've been involved in all sorts of advocacy, everything from trying cases and litigating cases in the trial and appellate courts to lobbying the state legislature, lobbying at the federal level, and being involved in organizing and mobilizing folks as well. And we're going to explore today how it all comes together in advocacy campaigns, and as I think it was Phillips said, really get under the hood. Before we jump in, though, I do want to first just acknowledge we have a couple of our national leaders in the group today, at least a few that I've seen so far. Laura Kennedy, who you all know very well, treasurer of the ARC's National Board, and we also have one of our former National Board presidents, Mohan Mehra. I think I saw his face in one of these little boxes, and there may be some others, but those are at least the folks that I've noticed so far. So I think it's important as we jump into this discussion that we keep in mind that the ARC is and has always been a disability rights advocacy organization. From the inception of the organization more than 70 years ago. And we together, and I love the ARC of New York using the phrase stronger together, we together have accomplished so much over the years through our advocacy. And whether it's establishing the right to public education for students with disabilities, whether it's our involvement in putting in place components of Medicare and Medicaid that and home and community-based services that really support people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, and their families, whether it is the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ABLE Act. I mean, there's a long list of victories that we have had as advocates, and it has been the result of a lot of work that happens behind the scenes, and in some cases over many years to achieve the victories. A lot of the progress in advocacy doesn't really happen overnight. And we have a great panel of folks today who will take us under the hood and really let us understand a lot more of what goes into successful advocacy campaigns, both in the short term and over the long term. And I thought as we get started, it might be helpful to go to, since we're in the midst of some extraordinary advocacy campaigns right now, it might be great to go to Nicole Jorwick and ask Nicole to provide us with a little bit of update on what's going on with the Budget Reconciliation Act. And I should mention President Biden was just in my hometown here in Baltimore just last night. Nicole?
Thanks, Peter. Yes, and I was just on the phone getting the most up to date information to share with you all. Although actually we were on the phone. I was on the phone because the positive thing is that HCBS is definitely still very strongly in the package, which is a testament to all of the advocacy all over the country, to families, individuals sharing their stories, including, I want to give a shout out to Philip in the ARC New York and Marco Damiani around the roundtable that was held with the White House over the summer. Keeping HCBS in the minds of the administration is incredibly important and has shown to pay off. And so we're happy that it's still in, but what I was just doing was running down a rumor that it had been cut by a great deal. Luckily, it was a false rumor. So where we are at right now, those are always the best kind if it's on the low side. And where we are at right now, originally, President Biden came out with the American Jobs Plan that included a $400 billion investment. Now, that was when the overall package was 3.5 trillion. I'm sure anyone who follows the news even a little bit has seen that the top line number, that $3.5 billion number, has come down. So that means some priorities have gotten kicked out. We're not in that list. So that's a victory in and of itself, a big victory. And then right now where we're at, the House Committee of Jurisdiction is Energy and Commerce on Medicaid, and they have passed 190 billion through. That's kind of our low water mark at this point, and we're hoping to get it more closer to 250 billion. And the reason it's really important to keep pushing for more, even though the top line number is coming down, is because the funding is to address both the workforce issues and access to services. And as we know, as everyone knows, and I know New York has had some strong campaigns in the area around direct care wages, it's really important. You can't just throw more people into a system that isn't being supported by well-paid workers. And so we've been, and I'll talk more about this later, but we've been working very closely with aging and labor, and along with obviously disability, to make sure that we're addressing both of those issues, which is why we need to keep seeing the number up. The positive news is that we're hearing, unlike a lot of other provisions that are going to be short-term, this is expected to be at least 10 years, which is the duration of the budget reconciliation package overall, because there is an understanding that states are going to need time to take this up, et cetera. And so I'm hopeful. I feel I'm going to knock on some wood when I say that, but I am hopeful that we are going to see something in terms of timing. Speaker Pelosi had set a goal for the House to vote. I say goal because it's a deadline, but it's not a deadline. So a goal to have the House vote out the package, the Build Back Better Act, by Halloween. There's a chance that happens. There's actually a fairly decent chance that some sort of compromise deal gets some publicity today, but we've been told that for a couple of days and nothing has happened. So, but it is likely that this is going to continue in the Senate until early December, possibly even until the end of the year. So the advocacy and all of the different strategies that Claire and Kristen and Peter and I are going to talk about, that we continue to do that. And it's going to take, I know that there can be some grassroots fatigue and other things, but we have to keep beating the drum because it is working, is a positive thing. That's if you walk away with that, just HCBS is in, and it's going to be long-term and it's going to be major. So I can share good news it feels like for once, after a lot of fighting to protect Medicaid, we're actually on the verge of really building it to be better for everyone.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great to bring us up to date for where we are at the moment, and really set the stage for our conversation today. And I think what we're gonna do next is we plan to let each of our panelists spend 2 minutes and just talk a little bit about the anatomy of an advocacy campaign from their perspective and the work they do. And so I'll turn to Claire first.
Thanks, Peter, and hello again, everyone. I think Nicole shared a really great overview, and this campaign that we have currently going is a great lens to have this broader 50,000 foot conversation. And the first thing that I want to say is it's not an accident who's on the call today, right? That we have me from the ARC of the US's grassroots advocacy work, Kristen from the comms team, Nicole from the policy team, Peter leading us all, because it's really those three core functions, policy, grassroots advocacy, and communications, that make up like the tripod of a campaign. And I believe the tripod is the strongest shape. And so I just want to kind of put us in that framework of that is how we think about campaigns at the ARC of the US, and then different work streams flow from each of those and are, you know, coordinated together in a cohesive message with a cohesive goal. So I want to share a little bit, thinking about this current Care Can't Wait campaign that Nicole just addressed, share a little bit of some of the grassroots advocacy tactics that we are employing to support our strategy. So first off, some more good news. We have this year to date, tracked over 122,000. I think when I checked a couple days ago, it was 217,000 actions to Congress. So that is calls, emails, tweets, texts, stories shared, which is just an absolutely incredible number. And that is from like the ARC's entire network. The ARC of New York's numbers are separate, but this is on a system that we share with the ARC of New York. So Philip and I are in constant communication on, you know, coordinating and sharing data and information back and forth. So that's kind of like our North Star, right? We want these contacts. We want members of Congress to be hearing from us, beating that drum. So direct contacts is number one of the elements of our advocacy campaign. Another one, and I'm just going to touch on it here because I know we're going to dive into it more deeply later, is sharing stories. Stories about how a policy, in this case, home and community-based services, impacts a person's life is one of the most, I say because it falls in my lane, powerful advocacy tools that we have. It is absolutely critical that members of Congress, their staff, the general public, everybody knows how the theoretical policies that we're talking about impact real people. It's just very different to share a person's story than say $400 billion, right? So we'll get into that more. We've also been, you know, one of the things that's really essential, the ARC has a huge network. We have a broad network around the country. That's what makes us so powerful, but it's not enough. We need more people getting involved. We need more people taking action. And so one of the things that we've been doing, in addition to the coalition work, which Nicole will talk about, is we have been working through paid social media campaigns to get our action alerts in front of like-minded individuals. So we use Facebook and Instagram's like targeting features to direct our action alerts to new people who, you know, maybe don't follow the ARC on Facebook, but follow other civil rights organizations, whether they're in the disability space or beyond. We are working hard to bring more people into the fold who should be with us, who should be fighting with us, and who should be part of this work. We're also making a ton of videos to educate people. We just filmed a video in Ohio with a storyteller about home and community-based services. We'll be pushing that out. And now, you know, the weather's nice. We have been pushing the drumbeat on Capitol Hill. Every week for the last 4 weeks, the ARC, in coalition with partners, has had some kind of an in-person, outside, COVID-safe event on Capitol Hill. We'll probably talk about this a little bit more, but one of the big things was 2 weeks ago, we hosted a vigil with partner organizations for 24 hours. I'm sure Nicole will mention it as well, where we shared stories about the importance of home and community-based services, which kind of goes back to like how all the pieces fit together, right? You share your story, it goes to your member of Congress, but it doesn't end there. And so for 24 hours, these stories were read and these stories were shared, and then culminated with a big delivery and press conference to Congress. So I'll stop there. I know that was a lot of information.
Really a lot of great information, Claire. And as we, you know, I was thinking of your description of the tripod, and then envisioning the tripod is standing, you know, poised on the shoulders of our hundreds of chapters around the country. And, Philip is part of our panel today to really bring the state and local chapter perspective into our conversation today. But that, is such an important part of the power that we have as the ARC. Claire is really speaking to a lot of the work that we do with chapters and our immediate partners, and Kristen really then steps in to amplify the message through the media, and so that we reach larger and larger audiences. We may have a couple 180,000 on our email lists, and chapters have tens of thousands on their email lists that they can reach. But there's a larger media strategy that's part of this work. And so, Kristen, let me invite you into the conversation and talk a little bit about how we use media as part of our campaign work.
Yeah. So media is really an important piece of what we do. And I think, what's top of mind for me is that what's been really, I think, both interesting and helpful in terms of advancing, the goals of like everyone here, is that we've seen a lot of major media outlets covering the issues. So New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, Huffington Post, NBC, MSNBC, those are outlets with obviously very extremely large and global audiences. So think of like the reach, I always think of like the reach when you talk about outlets like those. And not only, just it's cool to think like that these outlets are covering these really important issues, but also like think of the public education piece that's inevitably happening with every, quote from Peter or quote from Nicole, every interview, even if it's just on background where we're not necessarily quoted, but Nicole or Peter or someone else on our staff is providing important information that kind of like drives the rest of the story. So I just think that that stands out to me, that we're getting that kind of attention from those types of outlets. But that's not to say that local and smaller community outlets are not just as important. I think that there is a lot of value in that type of media coverage as well. I mean, the viewership, the audience may not be as big. However, with of course, news articles being online today, the reach is really exponential. So Kristen, who leads our communications team, the other Kristen with an E, we always talk about how we never discount any media outlet, big or small. So I think that it's important to consider how all media really is a great education tool, which is really important for us right now as we, work on these big, very consequential issues. It's just I think the media is such an important tool to raise awareness and sometimes to send a message, to our elected leaders across all levels of government, whether that's your city council or a member of Congress. And I think the media attention around these issues or around a person or around a vote, as we've been talking about lately, a vote that has, very big implications, can also serve as a form of pressure really to do the right thing. So I think we've been in a really good place. We've been a lot more, and we'll talk more about this, intentional about finding storytellers, both in grassroots advocacy and in media, like hand in hand, really, to tell these stories from a very personal perspective. And I'm encouraged by the fact that journalists reaching out to us almost always want, they want to speak to a member of our staff, as an expert, right, to really break things down. But they also do want to hear firsthand from people who are directly impacted, people with IDD families, DSPs. And so we've been really, building on that and building, trying to cultivate these, like a solid list of people. It's a slow process, because there's so much work to be done, but we're going to continue this effort into 2022. And I just think it's a really we're finding that it's a very effective way of communicating with the public and educating the public and trying to advance our goals. So that's kind of like the big picture on the media front at the moment.
Great, thank you, Kristen. And so there are opportunities to cultivate with media, as Kristen has been describing, and we have been fortunate in establishing relationships with a number of the major media outlets. There are also kind of unusual opportunities to get our message out. I mentioned one happened, was it just yesterday or 2 days ago? Claire had the opportunity to do an Instagram live with Sephora. Sephora, the beauty products company, has made us their charity, their charity rewards partner for October. This is the second year in a row they're doing it. And don't you know that when Claire was doing the Instagram live with Sephora, she was talking about our advocacy strategy. So, it's not traditional media, but we really have to be poised to kind of seize on every opportunity to get the advocacy message out. I think one of the things that's been really unique about our work over the last 2 years is the way we have forged partnerships and coalitions. I think a way that's a little different. I mean, the ARC always works in coalition. We tend to work, historically have tended to work in coalition with a lot of other disability organizations. But the current campaign, the work over the last 2 years, we've forged coalitions, new coalitions that have really garnered a lot of strength. And I'm going to go back to Nicole to talk about the coalition work and who we brought around the table, or who we're sitting around the table with, I should say.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Peter. And as Peter mentioned, the ARC has always been stronger because we've been working at the national level with coalitions like the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities and the Disability and Aging Collaborative that I co-chair. That at least broadens it out also to include aging groups as well. But what we started to figure out during COVID, especially during the first year, when it was really difficult to get any meaningful investments, given the political climate and everything else, and also with the kind of expectation that sometimes, and I'm sure that I know this from my experience working at the state level, during the summer of last year, groups that were working on paid leave as well as childcare, and then groups that were working on, at the time they called it long-term care. I would say that the biggest impact we've had on the coalition overall is that they now say HCBS. They don't just say home care. I mean, they might occasionally say it because it's the thing that makes sense, but that's one just kind of specific example of where we've had really, I was just out with the head of the National Women's Law Center, and she said, I still use the 2 sentences that you gave me. And that's the benefit, because so many, whether we were all working in our own silos, childcare groups, HCBS groups, and then also groups working on paid leave, and also all getting stuck kind of fighting for scraps at the bottom. And that's something, and kind of coming at it from a scarcity mentality. And we all started saying, what if we joined together? And that's where the Care Can't Wait Coalition formed. We started talking about care as infrastructure around that time last summer, and it has been very successful. We've been able to kind of play whack-a-mole with different issue areas kind of falling out of favor and that sort of thing. And Kristen and Kristen work with the comms group out of that. Claire works with the mobilization and organizing group out of that, so that we're all amplifying each other's message. And it's been really beneficial, obviously, for the ARC, and the ARC is the only disability specific group that's part of that coalition. And so we've been able to influence their messaging, and it's leading to, frankly, where we are right now, which is all of those care priorities, at least in some form, will hopefully turn up in the reconciliation package. Speaker Pelosi just said at an event that we had yesterday that the Democrats are united behind Care Can't Wait. I mean, that's something that I think we were all dreaming about when we first started talking. And so those coalitions are extremely important, and making sure that, and looking to make sure that we're expanding those, not just at the national level, but how we can how we can duplicate that at the state level to make sure that we're not fighting for scraps and that we're all stronger together to use it.
Well, thanks, Nicole. Really great opportunity here then for Philip to jump in, because as you know, Nicole's talking about Claire and Kristen and Nicole are talking about the work that's going on at the national level and some of the organizing and coalition building, you know, the same activity has been happening powerfully within New York State, and we need ultimately the troops rallied all across the country if we're going to have an impact. So, Philip, can you take us to the state and local level?
Sure. Yeah, I will say we were looking back on what we've been doing since July, and you know, I can see that we've had, you know, at least 2 fairly public events, whether there's a grassroots or whether it's a notable hearing or some other big release. And that we've been doing in addition to our continual grassroots work and outreach to the media. And I know that the support of the ARC-US has really been there with the federal policy portion. And I don't know if we've ever done this before with our legislative meetings, but I've encouraged people to meet with their congresspeople and their local state officials and let each other know what's going on in the state and federal, because some of it is so linked together now, where there's a lot of funding from the federal government, but maybe the state isn't doing all their work that they have to do so that the funding gets to where it needs to be. And no one's going to tell your congressperson. They're just not going to know that unless you're the one that tells them. So we've done, I believe, a decent amount of work with cross-pollinating those conversations and making sure that we inform everyone and not try to keep any of those into their own silos, because they do affect each other in a lot of ways. And I will say, just as a blurb, our phone to action advocacy emails have topped 20,000, which is super exciting. And again, like, we've been using it and expanding the use of the tools, and that's something that we'll continue to do. I know everyone that I've talked to in the organization has really appreciated the support and the tool. And again, that will just continue to get better, and it's a great tool for storytelling, which is why I wanted to talk about that today, to increase our advocacy. And so we're going to steal every one of the ARC-US's ideas to support all our work. But yeah, so I just, and someone had mentioned, you know, grassroots or advocacy fatigue, and I can say there's a certain excitement from our grassroots advocates, and we're not letting up. We haven't done just one campaign and just let it fall by the wayside. Like, we keep it going and we update them and we say it's not over yet. We haven't achieved anything, and now we're going into starting to engage our state legislators with our budget requests, and we have those priorities down with an organization that we work with, New York Disability Advocates, which is a coalition, but very much so disabilities focused. But I, as an example of what we're doing moving forward, seeing what the ARC-US has done in terms of identifying those organizations that share common interests on a very specific topic, we are looking outside of our organization to say, who can we partner with that is going to make us all stronger? Because I know that there's a historical hesitancy to do that, because no one wants the other person, you know, there's a pot of money, if it's $100 million, no one wants to work with 10 people and only get the 10 million, when you could have just worked by yourself and maybe gotten 90 and the others got, you know, again, the scraps. But if we all work together, we can make a bigger difference with our voice. So I know we're certainly, that's something we're echoing. In terms of I'll go back to the media conversation and local media conversation. With the rallies we've had across the state, we've relied on our chapters and those local stakeholders to know their local media. And it helps us, Kate Guerin, our Director of Communications, to get those stories out to the local media. And we will help support that. because it does make a difference when your advocates see what happens in their local paper. You can have a New York Times article all day long, or MSNBC, which is fantastic and completely awesome to get a New York Times anything. But if they're not seeing that in Buffalo, or if they're not seeing somewhere else, then in their mind, there is, their actions aren't making a difference. And so that's something that we've been very conscious about, to make sure that we're spreading that word, that we're telling the story from across the state. And we do that through our weekly advocacy updates. We try to cram as much in there as possible to inform everyone and make sure that everyone's on the same page, and what we're doing towards this goal is not ending. And so that's just some of the things. I guess I know I went a little bit all over the place, but I did have a question for Nicole about the coalitions. Going back to that, did these happen organically? How did they start? Did it start with one person, then there was a light bulb, or how did that occur?
Sure. So first, I just want to make a couple of points off of what you said. One of which is that also, and Claire's the one who I learned this from, so that also federal legislators look just as much at local news as they do at MSNBC and the New York Times. So that's also why local media is really important. And then on the grassroots fatigue point, but also the point that Peter made around chapters, it is never lost on me when I'm on the Hill. I'm just one person, but the reason that we have the access that we have, and the reason that we're invited into broader is because of the network that we have. And we wouldn't have the grassroots that we have if we don't have the chapters that we have. So I think that all of that, I want to recognize that, because I certainly know that as I'm advocating on the Hill. And so to your question, Philip, a lot of things do happen organically, but what I would say is that it's built on recognition of work. So a lot of why the ARC was started being part of Here Can't Wait Coalition was because the ARC started doing work in the paid leave space, and was, again, the only disability voice in that space, not to talk about how it needs to be inclusive enough to make sure it takes care of people like me and Kristen, people that are siblings of people with disabilities that might need to take time off, those sort of things. And because we did great work started by TJ and continued by Bethany and Lily, that's how we started getting brought into the larger conversations. And Bethany was like, well, if you're talking about long-term care, you need to, so those it does sort of start to happen organically, but the way that it happens and the way that you stick, of course, is by doing the work. And it started off very policy team focused, but we've been able to, as I talked about, Claire and Kristen and others are part of these subgroups that have sort of formed, and making sure that you're following through, making sure that organizationally we're holding up our end of the bargain. That's how we get into things like the Equality Can't Wait grant that we're a part of. It's because we were performing. They didn't need if they just needed just a disability group, they probably could have found someone. But it's about making those connections and being seen as a subject matter expert, and also and our chapter network is a big reason too, why, and the grassroots too.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
I think to just kind of like dovetail off or piggyback off what you're saying about the chapter network. So I've worked in DC for a long time. I've worked at a couple of different affiliated chapter type related nonprofits. And one of the things that sets the ARC apart and just positions us so differently is that we truly have a national reach. The ARC is everywhere. A lot of organizations who are operating in DC will tell you that they have a national reach, that they have chapters, but maybe they have like a couple here and there. The ARC is really everywhere. And so, kind of going back to what Nicole said about it's the work that helps build these coalitions. We delivered 7,500 stories. That's our chapters. That's our chapter networks. That's our advocates across the country. And there are not a lot of other organizations truly positioned to do that. And that is just what makes the ARC so powerful. And that's why people want to work with us. And that's why we're effective, and we're going to be effective this time.
So I want to jump in here and thank you, Claire, for making that point about the ARC being everywhere, and nowhere is that more important, more apparent than in New York State. where the ARC is all across the state. You have the presence of the ARC through the Extraordinary Chapter Network. You know, we're talking a lot about stories, and Claire, you know, one of the, and I was thinking all the chapters have stories. Everybody knows someone who has stories, and we think about using the stories for advocacy. We think about using the stories for fundraising. What do people need to be aware of in thinking about how to work with individuals and families around stories so that we can do that work in a way that is both extraordinarily impactful, but also really, really respectful of the people that we're working with?
That's a great question, because we talk about stories all the time. Like you said, Peter, we all have our own stories. We know people with stories. It's just a huge part of our work, and it's really the foundation of the ARC in many ways, I think. But we at the ARC US have, over the last couple of years, really kind of put some scaffolding, some kind of parameters, not parameters, but scaffolding around our story work, and kind of have been really deliberate in how we do it. So I just want to give you like a little bit of a sense of what that looks like. So our process essentially, it starts with, there's really three components: finding storytellers, vetting and prepping, and then connecting with advocacy opportunities. So the first one, finding storytellers, it's interesting because even though we are a network of stories, that can be a little bit difficult sometimes. And so one of the things that we found is that we've been doing for the last couple of years is thinking about the year ahead, whether it's the end of the year, or maybe it's the, thinking about your next legislative session. What are the issues that you're going to be focused on? And being really deliberate about identifying individuals and families who have stories on those particular topics. So that's number one, finding storytellers. We also have, and I can send this to Philip to send around, but we have a toolkit for chapters on building your own story bank that has a lot of different tools and tips and resources from other chapters and from the ARC US as well. And then the next thing is vetting and prepping. So a lot of people, have amazing stories, but maybe need a little bit of support in how to connect to the policy that's happening. We recently, I heard a presentation from a self-advocate that I loved with advice on sharing stories. And he said, be concise, be precise, and be nice. And I love that. He was sharing that with other self-advocates. And so what we do is we really just like get on the phone with people, and we have a little bit of an interview guide, but it's really truly more of a conversation. And part of what we're sussing out is, hey, these are the legislative things we're going to be working on. And this is, the second part of it is, though, what is this individual's, what are their interests? What are their goals around advocacy? Maybe their goals professionally. What are the types of things that they're interested in doing? Because it's really critical that this is not just a transactional relationship, that we are trying to work with storytellers as true leaders in our movement and in our organizations. And so that's something that we try to be incredibly mindful of. And so then the third bucket is connecting these storytellers with advocacy opportunities. And we've talked about what some of those can be, because I would divide them up essentially into two buckets: some that we make ourselves, and then some that come to us, right? And so some examples of things that we make ourselves is meetings with legislators, videos. We've done a ton of videos over the last few years, and we've really gotten a lot of traction out of them. You can show them at events, you can send them to legislators. We've done a lot of paid campaigns around them as well. Blogs, graphics, press releases, rallies, the Vigil that I mentioned. And then more on the kind of come to us side, although it's not like we just sit there. There's a ton of work that happens to make this happen, is more on the media and partner event side. So it does take a lot of effort. And one thing that we found, that even though, just to kind of put a summary on it, even though the ARC does have this incredible network of storytellers, we really have made an effort to be much more deliberate, and we are definitely seeing that pay off.
Peter,
Sorry, I was saying, I really love that concise, precise, and nice. And it was concise, precise, and nice as well. I want to go to, I want to in a minute go to Kristen Wright and talk more about how you go about generating earned media. But before we do that, I noted that Marco Damiani had his hand up. So Marco, you want to unmute and jump in with a question or comment?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Actually, you and Claire read my mind a little bit about my question / comment. This morning there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times entitled something like Helen Keller and the Problem with Inspiration Porn. And it really kind of got me thinking more and more about the kinds of things we see on TV that captivate, which is nice, but they don't necessarily influence. And you sort of started to answer that question, because I think we can all get caught up in inspirational stories. They're wonderful, but they're not really based in the human life of a person with a disability. They're not really based in the trials, tribulations, and aspirations they have on a daily basis. And in my mind, at least, those are the things that really influence. There's captivation, there's advocacy, and there's actually influencing, which you guys are doing a great job on, to get more resources to this field. So maybe just add a little more to that. You already answered a lot of it, I think, without me even asking, but this whole idea of inspiration porn is an interesting challenge for us, I think, as a field.
I think that's a really great point, and I'll jump in here, but I'm sure Kristen and Nicole even may have other thoughts. But the first thing that comes to mind for me is it's all about the connection to the ask, right? Not just telling stories about our lives for the sake of telling them, although there's probably a role for that, somewhere about the ARC and about our organizations. But in this context, it's about an ask. Right? What are we asking our members of Congress or our state legislators to do? And how does that relate to that person's story? And so sometimes, when we're working with storytellers and that's the part where we need a little bit, where they might need a little bit of support. There's a lot of, I work with storytellers around the country, and, sometimes there's confusion around the different programs and waivers and things like that. And so helping them kind of suss that out can be a huge part of it. So yeah, to me, it's all about the connection to the specific advocacy, to the specific ask that we have. But I'll let Kristen or Nicole jump in with any other. Peter.
Kristen, why don't you jump in there?
Yeah, I think that, Marco, that's a really, really great question, because I think it can be very easy to fall into sort of that dimension. And I think, because the human experience is so fascinating and interesting, I think that it's easy to go down that path. And I'll speak personally for me, I'm sometimes challenged by this, because I think because my background is in journalism, and I've always just had a passion for just looking at someone's life situation, like looking at them as, what everybody has a story, right? But I think Claire is right, that it's really important for us to remember, like, the ask, and like, what is the connection to what we're doing, or one of our coalition groups is doing, to like right a wrong, or to make things better, or to advance our priorities, or to make sure that in our with the ARC, make sure that people with IDD are truly respected, and that their families are receiving the support that they need, and that people with IDD are receiving the support. So I think I think you're totally right. It's very easy to for that to happen, the inspiration porn idea. But I think that I think we try to be as purposeful as we can about like connecting those stories, like connecting the dots, like making sure like that the stories are going somewhere, not just like, this is a really sad story, this is a really, inspirational story. But what is that? Like, what's the next thing? Like, why are we telling you this? How can you act? What can you do to make, to address, this problem, or to support to support our advocacy issues. So I'm glad that you asked that, because it's something that that I'm challenged by, and that I think about a lot.
Yeah, it's just, Nicole, before you jump in, it's just not inspiration porn as an issue. It's also, not feeding into what sometimes is referred to as the pity party. And finding ways that we can communicate about the brutal challenges and circumstances that people face without it degenerating into pity, and really shifting it to be about justice. So Nicole, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it certainly, stories also really make the case with policy too. Claire mentioned in her earlier remarks the story Vigil that we did last week. It's also something that was much better because we did it as part of the coalition. If the ARC threw together a 24-hour vigil, we would have been able to do it, but we wouldn't have had all the people power. We also wouldn't have had all some of the fancier, it's always good to have someone else's checkbook too. So it really was great, but we were able to deliver all of those stories. Stories put faces on an issue. So that's really in my view, Marco, to your point, the only way that we should be using stories is, and some of them might elicit some pity. I think that's especially for family caregivers. Sometimes family caregivers stay in the shadows because they don't want to be pitied. They just want to paint a real picture of what it looks like to not have the supports that you need. So Peter's absolutely right. And I think threading that needle is something that we've been able to do more and more of. And so I think, though, that I know from, especially in 2017, the last time I did the last time I did just quite as many, about 150 Hill meetings, I could share every data point about what Medicaid does, but it was those stories that stuck with the legislators, that stuck with the staff. And it's just as true. I think because we are seeing so many more, a variety of more media outlets being interested in this story, they're not just interested in the happy-go-lucky stuff. Which I think is going to be really positive moving forward, because we're going to have to continue to build.
So I want to see.
Sorry, Peter. I was going to say, I had one of those conversation interviews with a family member just a couple months ago, and she wanted to share a story, but she didn't think what she had to say was what we wanted to talk about. So I just had a conversation about her daily life or some of the issues in her life or what's going on. And I said, okay, so these are the policy points that fit into all these areas. So we can make that connection together. So I 100% agree if you don't make those connections to the policy. And she was just like, oh, okay. So I think she was more excited to know that she would be advocating towards a solution rather than just talking about her problem.
And a really important point there, Philip, about connecting the dots between the story and the policy objectives. And I think we face similar issues when trying to generate earned media. And so, Kristen, I'm going to turn more to you. Obviously there's paid media, and unfortunately, I don't see that the ARC's going to be having commercials during the Super Bowl anytime soon, but I would love for that pot of money to descend on us to enable us to do that. So we are, as a federation, really dependent on earned media, and helping, the earned media, I think, requires a lot of dot connecting for the members of the media. And perhaps you could share some, practical tips for the New York chapters about things that they can do to generate more earned media in their communities.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think one is know your media, meaning, and it really is a simple thing. Just keeping track of which reporters, which producers are working on the stories that are related to disability, civil rights, human rights, legislation, children and families. Figure out, which of those reporters and producers have a genuine interest in these issues, because really that's how you're going to generate good stories. And I don't think that's very hard to do. You can, jump on the phone with someone and pretty much immediately know. You really can tell if someone, really has a genuine interest. And then I would stay in, close contact with those reporters. When I was a reporter, I would receive a lot, and I think it's important to keep this in mind, is that they're getting a lot of pitch emails all the time. And most of the ones that I would get were like blasted out to the masses. So they were like not they weren't like personalized to me and the stories that I covered typically. And so then many of those pitch emails were like totally off the mark. And so then I just ignored them. So I think a great thing about our office, and probably the same is true for most of you, is that we don't always work with like a big PR firm day to day, although there are advantages to that. But the nice thing is that you can really personalize your pitches and make them make sense in terms of like who is on the receiving end. And another thing is, I think that I always found it, I always, as a reporter, I always went back to the same people if they were good and if they were helpful. I mean, why wouldn't you? So we, in our office, we have a number of regulars who I feel like we've successfully built solid relationships with, and they trust us. They know that we'll be responsive to their requests, and in return, then they're responsive to us. So when we proactively reach out to them, they're responsive to us because we've kind of developed this mutual reciprocal relationship with them. So I think a lot of it is really, just as anything in life, is relationship building and being consistent and being responsive and respectful and pitching them on good ideas, knowing who you're pitching. Sometimes I know, like with like the systems that we have, it does make sense to do sometimes the blast, right? Because we have a system that allows us to reach hundreds of people, which is great. But I would also take the next step sometimes and like try to pinpoint, target specific people, specific journalists that you've worked with before that you think would be interested, and send like the separate, outreach to. I think those are really the big things.
Thank you, Kristen. So we're coming up on our last 3 minutes. I noticed Laura Kennedy has her hand up. Before that, we have Kirk Lewis had a question in the chat asking about PAC fundraising and lobbying versus grassroots constituent-based efforts. And I would just throw in there that as 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, we really can't be involved in any partisan political activity. So getting involved with PACs is not something that we as organizations can do, although certainly folks within the organizations could participate in contributing or being involved with PACs. And they're very detailed tax rules. Now that doesn't mean we can't do any election related advocacy, because we can, but we have to be strictly very careful about it being nonpartisan. They're very complicated IRS rules about that. Laura, you want to jump in with a question or comment?
Quick question. The National ARC has 28 position statements that are reviewed and updated on a regular 2-year cycle basis every 6 years. And the ARC New York has had their positions. And could you just touch on how those positions help in terms of the media when they approach on a topic, and how relevant they are to the advocacy that we do?
Kristen, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can add. I can offer this. I have used the position statements quite a bit in terms of when writing press statements and writing press releases often, especially when the statements are issue oriented, which is most of them, because then I can go to those statements and I can put together a statement that really gives our stance as an organization in a way that's going to be consistent, in a way that I know that we've all agreed to. And it's not just sort of like, me going off the top of my head. So the position statements have been very helpful for me, and I know for the other Kristen as well, from that standpoint, in terms of just like going to a body of work that we know we can rely on as like, this is where the ARC stands on, this particular issue. And so it's been helpful in that sense. I think I've also sent position statements, links out to reporters here and again when they've asked, when they've asked specifically about, where we stand on certain issues. So it is helpful. They are helpful.
And I would echo that whenever I'm preparing for a interview with a reporter on a given subject, I always go back and review the position statements to make sure that I am accurately channeling what the ARC believes on any of the subjects covered in those 28 statements. So it is very important. Philip, I think we're at our end of our time. Can I turn the floor back over to you to wrap us up?
I know we're landing the plane and I feel like we could probably keep going, but great conversation, everyone. I know that it's just going to spur more of them. So I want to thank Peter, Kristen, Claire, and Nicole for their time. Also to thank them for their leadership and always answering my email or call. So I want to say a special shout out to Nicole, who is moving on to another opportunity, but we're also excited because that just means we have another place to go, an ally to work with. So I just want to say thank you so much. You've really been a great impact in my almost 2 years here at the ARC New York. So I wish you the best, and we wish you the best, and don't be a stranger. So I guess with that,
thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. So I guess with that, I'll keep it short. Bridget, unless you have anything else.
No, I think we're good. I'm glad that everybody enjoyed the session, and we have our annual awards presentation coming up at 3 o'clock.
Yeah, and this recording will be available probably by Monday or Tuesday.
Monday, yeah, I would think.
Okay.
And I would just offer in closing that we'll look forward to attending your annual meeting next year in person.
Great.
Awesome.
As well.
Likewise.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.